She was never meant to be here. The voice was sharp, cutting through the whispers of the ballroom like a blade. Olivia Whitmore stood in the corner, her back pressed against the cold marble of the grand hall. The music swirled around her, but it felt distant, muffled. Her heart beat too loudly in her chest, and every laugh, every glance seemed to pierce her. The room was alive with luxury, a living portrait of aristocracy, but she was invisible, except to those who deemed her unworthy. The lords and ladies danced, their eyes filled with the cold politeness of a society bound by unwritten rules, and Olivia, with her modest dress and quiet demeanor, could not have felt more out of place. She had come here to help, to assist the others in their preparations, never dreaming she would be noticed. She wasn't supposed to be a part of this world, not in the way the others were. The women here had jewels that sparkled like the stars above, their laughter bright and sharp. She, however, had nothing but a dress that had long since lost its luster and hands that knew the weight of hard work. She didn't belong in the same room as these women. Yet here she was, stranded in the sea of them, unnoticed, disregarded, a mere afterthought. Her eyes wandered across the ballroom. There, in the center of it all, was Duke Theodore Ashford. He moved like a force of nature, his presence commanding the room without a single word. His eyes were cold, his face an impassive mask of authority. People parted for him like water for a king, and he didn't even have to ask. The Duke. The very name sent a ripple of fear and reverence through the nobility. Tall, handsome, untouchable. Olivia had heard stories, whispers in the corners of darkened rooms, rumors of his power, his icy demeanor, his unrivaled status in high society. But those were just stories. They had no place in her life. She was nothing. She wasn't even supposed to be seen. But today, for reasons unknown, her world would shatter. As she lingered near the edge of the ballroom, trying to avoid drawing attention to herself, the Duke's gaze flickered across the crowd. It was as if time slowed. His eyes moved over the room, scanning, analyzing, and then stopping. His gaze locked onto hers. For a brief moment, the room around her disappeared. She felt a shift in the air, a tension that was palpable. The music seemed to fade into nothing, the laughter silenced. Olivia froze. Her breath caught in her throat. His eyes held hers with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He wasn't looking past her. He wasn't looking around her. He was looking at her. And in that single glance, everything in her shifted. He stood there for a heartbeat longer than was appropriate, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly, and then he turned his head. The room seemed to rush back into focus, the world continuing its dance as though nothing had happened. But Olivia's world had just tilted on its axis. His gaze lingered. The music resumed. The people moved. But Olivia felt paralyzed, as if the weight of his stare had rooted her to the spot. She could feel the eyes of the room on her now, though no one dared speak of it. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to be seen. But the Duke had seen her. And it wasn't a look of indifference. It wasn't casual. There was something else in it, something that made her heart skip, a question she wasn't sure how to answer. Olivia Whitmore. The voice came from behind her. She turned quickly, startled. It was the matchmaker, a woman who had once ignored her presence entirely, now looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Yes, Olivia said, her voice barely a whisper. The matchmaker's eyes flickered toward the Duke, then back to Olivia, her lips curving into a tight smile. The Duke has asked for you. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Olivia's heart slammed against her ribs. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't speak. She only nodded, feeling as though the ground had just been pulled from beneath her. The matchmaker gestured for her to follow, but Olivia couldn't move. The Duke had asked for her. For her? Her? She had been nothing, discarded, forgotten. Now she was being called. As she walked toward him, the room seemed to part before her, and she felt every eye on her. Her breath caught in her throat again, and she tried to ignore the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to overtake her. The Duke turned as she approached, his eyes narrowing once more, studying her with a quiet intensity. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His mere presence was enough to command attention, to bring silence to the chaos around him. He stood there, motionless, waiting. His hand, cold and steady, reached out toward her. She hesitated for a moment, her heart racing, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. She took a step closer. Time froze. The world seemed to halt, just for that second. Every eye was on her. Every breath held. And then, he spoke. You are mine. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest as she stood before the Duke, his gaze steady, unwavering. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, the laughter and chatter dying in an instant. The Duke's presence was commanding, every inch of him radiating authority. The eyes of the aristocracy flickered between them, whispers beginning to stir in hushed tones. She was no longer the forgotten wallflower in the corner. She had become the center of attention, and the Duke's silent command was enough to leave the room in a suffocating stillness. His hand remained outstretched, the fingers hovering just inches from hers, waiting for her to make the first move. She could feel the weight of their collective gaze pressing down on her, each second stretching longer than the last. For a moment, Olivia considered stepping back. She considered fleeing, retreating to the shadows where she belonged. But the Duke had chosen her. Chosen her when she had been nothing. Nothing but a woman looked over and dismissed. She couldn't look away from him. His expression was unreadable, his eyes sharp, like two blades poised to cut through any pretense. She couldn't breathe. His hand was still there, inviting yet demanding, his fingers flexing ever so slightly, urging her forward. Her hand moved on its own accord, trembling slightly as she reached for his. The contact was electric. The moment their hands met, the room seemed to explode back to life. The whispers became louder, the tension crackling in the air like static before a storm. Olivia felt the heat of his skin, firm and unyielding, his grip strong as he closed his fingers around hers. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself, but her pulse raced. This was no ordinary dance. The Duke was no ordinary man. She had read the stories, heard the rumors about his coldness, his power. They said he ruled over men and kingdoms alike, unmoved by the whims of anyone. But now, in this moment, she could feel it. The power he held over her, over everyone in the room. She was his now, whether she was ready for it or not. As they moved through the crowd, she couldn't help but notice the way people parted for them. Eyes turned, heads bowed. There was no escape from the gaze of the Duke, and she was caught in it. She had been nothing but a servant, an invisible shadow, but now, she was with him. The contrast between them could not have been more stark. She, a woman who had been cast aside by her family, whose name was whispered in shame, and he, a duke, a man whose very name made men quake in fear. He led her across the ballroom, each step deliberate, the weight of his steps echoing in her mind. The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words. Olivia could feel his gaze on her, but it wasn't warm or comforting. It was calculating, as though he was weighing her every movement, reading her like a book he intended to write. And yet, despite everything, despite the power and control he exuded, there was a part of her that couldn't look away. She didn't understand it. She didn't know if it was fear or something else, something deeper that she couldn't name. They reached the center of the ballroom, where the crowd had fallen into a hushed silence. The music played on, but it felt like a distant hum, drowned out by the overwhelming tension. The Duke stopped in the middle of the floor, turning to face her. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks as the eyes of the room shifted to her, to them. The whispers were back, louder now, more insistent. She could almost hear them. Asterisk, who is she? Why her? Asterisk, Olivia's heart clenched, but she kept her chin high, determined to appear unbothered. The Duke was still holding her hand, his grip unwavering. The weight of his touch sent a shiver down her spine, and yet, she didn't pull away. She stood tall, facing him, waiting. The Duke's lips parted slightly, just enough for her to hear his low voice. I do not make mistakes, Olivia. His words were measured, sharp. I see what others cannot. She blinked, unsure of what to say, but the words caught in her throat. He was looking at her differently now, not with disdain, but with something that felt like recognition. It was as if, for the first time, he was truly seeing her. Olivia's mind raced, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion. She wanted to speak, to ask him what he meant, but the Duke didn't wait. He pulled her closer, his hand firmly around hers as he led her into the next waltz. The crowd around them parted once more, their stares like daggers. This was her new reality. A life where the Duke's power overshadowed everything. A life where she was no longer invisible. The music swirled around them, the sound distant and surreal. She felt as if she were floating, swept up in the movement of the dance. Her mind was in a haze, but her body moved with his, instinctively matching his steps. The Duke's presence was overwhelming, his every move deliberate and confident. The power dynamic between them was clear, and it was impossible to ignore. He was in control. She was at his mercy. As they danced, Olivia couldn't help but wonder, was this truly what she had wanted? Or had she just been swept away by the force of the Duke's will, a pawn in a game she didn't fully understand? Her heart hammered in her chest, the uncertainty gnawing at her. But one thing was certain, her life had just changed, and she had no idea where it was going. All she could do was follow. The Duke had chosen her, and now, there was no turning back. The music played softly in the background, but for Olivia, it was nothing but noise. She could feel her heart thudding in her chest, each beat louder than the next. The Duke's presence beside her was overwhelming, like a shadow that loomed over her every move. She could feel the heat of his hand still gripping hers, unyielding, commanding. She had been invisible for so long, but now, here she was, dancing. In the center of the ballroom, every eye on her. The weight of their gaze felt suffocating. She tried to focus on the rhythm of the dance, but her thoughts were clouded. What was happening? She had never been chosen for anything before, let alone by a man like him. The Duke, Theodore Ashford, the man who controlled everything, who had the power to make or break a person with a single word. As they moved across the floor, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking on a tightrope. Every step, every glance, felt like a test. He didn't speak, but she could feel his eyes on her, studying her, as if he was waiting for her to make a mistake. And then it happened. As they swirled around the room, she felt the pressure of his hand shift ever so slightly. The tiniest movement, but it sent a shock through her body. Her foot caught on the edge of her dress, and before she could stop herself, she stumbled. The Duke's grip tightened, his fingers wrapping around hers like iron. He steadied her with a single, effortless motion, his other hand coming to her waist, guiding her with a firm but controlled touch. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She was so close to him now, so close that she could feel the warmth of his body, the strength in his frame. She could feel the tension radiating off him, like a silent storm waiting to break. His presence was suffocating, but it was also undeniable. She was at his mercy, and she knew it. They continued to dance, the floor beneath their feet moving in sync with their every step. But the tension in the air was palpable, thick with unspoken words and unacknowledged feelings. Olivia felt as though she was being pulled in two different directions. Part of her wanted to pull away, to break free from the power that the Duke held over her, but another part of her wanted to stay. There was something about the way he moved, the way he held her, that made her feel like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The Duke's eyes never left hers. His expression remained unreadable, but she could see the subtle shift in his gaze, a flicker of something dark, something dangerous, lurking just beneath the surface. She couldn't quite place it, but it unsettled her in a way that she didn't know how to explain. They danced in silence, the rest of the room fading into the background, the world narrowing until there was nothing but the Duke and her. She was acutely aware of his every movement, the way his hand held her waist, the way his fingers lightly brushed against the small of her back. It was enough to make her heart race, but she couldn't pull away. The moment felt suspended in time, a slow-burning tension building between them, waiting to explode. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the dance was over. The music came to a halt, the sounds of the orchestra fading into silence. The Duke released her hand, but not before his fingers lingered for a moment longer than necessary. Olivia's breath hitched, her body still humming from the contact. She looked up at him, but his expression remained unreadable, distant. He didn't say a word, just nodded once, his eyes scanning the room before he turned and walked away. Olivia stood there for a moment, unable to move, unable to breathe. The ballroom seemed to close in on her, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. What had just happened? What was this strange pull she felt toward him, this connection that she couldn't explain? She had been nothing but a servant, overlooked, ignored. But now she was something. She was seen, and the Duke had chosen her. Olivia didn't know what that meant, but she knew one thing. Her life would never be the same. And as she stood there, trying to steady her breath, she realized that everything she thought she knew about herself, about her place in this world, had just been turned upside down. The Duke had chosen her. But what did that mean for the future? And what would happen next? She didn't know, but she knew she was about to find out. The ballroom had come alive once again, but this time, the atmosphere was charged with something far more potent than the elegance of a high society gathering. Olivia could feel it, the tension in the air, the unspoken judgment that swirled around her. She had been chosen, but it wasn't just her. It was the Duke's power that was now linked to her, and the weight of it felt crushing. The aristocrats whispered, their eyes never leaving her, their murmurs thick with disbelief. She was no longer the unnoticed wallflower. She was a pawn in a game far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Her chest tightened as she watched the other women, their faces painted with masks of polite disdain. They knew, just as she did, that she was the Duke's chosen one. But they did not understand why. Olivia felt the sting of their glares, the cold, calculated smiles they offered her. Their eyes didn't burn with jealousy. No, this was something colder. It was the unmistakable judgment of a society that had deemed her unworthy. And now, she was standing on the precipice, the eyes of everyone on her, waiting for her to fall. As the Duke moved through the room, his eyes never once leaving her, she could feel his gaze, intense and unyielding. It wasn't the look of a man who had merely chosen a companion for the evening. It was the look of a man who had marked her, branded her with his attention in a way that left her no room for escape. His presence was suffocating, a constant weight on her shoulders. She had never felt so exposed. The floor beneath her seemed to shift, and she stumbled slightly. His hand was there immediately, steadying her, but it wasn't just a gesture of support, it was a command. His fingers, firm against her wrist, guided her through the sea of people. Olivia didn't dare look up, but she could feel the whispers intensify as the Duke led her to the center of the room. The entire ballroom seemed to part for them, the crowd stepping back as if they were witnessing something momentous, something that they were not meant to see. Her pulse raced in her ears, drowning out everything but the heavy steps of the Duke's boots on the polished floor. As they reached the center, he stopped. The music softened, as if the orchestra itself could feel the shift in the air. His grip on her wrist tightened for a split second, and her breath caught in her throat. The crowd was silent. Olivia's gaze lifted for the first time, and she saw the faces of the nobility, their expressions a mixture of awe and quiet horror. No one had expected this. The Duke, always so controlled, so untouchable, had chosen her. The shift in power was undeniable. She was no longer invisible. She was now the center of their attention, the subject of their fascination. But it wasn't just admiration they were offering. It was something far more dangerous, disdain. The whispers began again, louder this time, more insistent. They had seen her, this woman who was not supposed to be part of their world, and they were torn between confusion and outrage. A ripple of discomfort passed through the crowd, and Olivia could feel it. She could feel the weight of their judgment, but she couldn't escape it. The Duke was still standing beside her, his presence so overwhelming that she could hardly breathe. His hand shifted to her waist, a firm, possessive touch that sent a shiver down her spine. The warmth of his palm against her skin was electric, but it was also a reminder of the reality she was now part of. This wasn't a fairy tale. This wasn't romance. This was power. The Duke's eyes remained locked on hers, but there was no softness in his gaze. No affection. It was cold, calculating, as if he were assessing her in a way that no one had ever done before. He spoke, his voice low but unmistakably commanding. "Do not mistake this for a kindness, Olivia. You are here because I have chosen you. But that does not make you safe." His words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She had known that being chosen by the Duke wouldn't come without its consequences, but hearing it spoken aloud, so plainly, was a different thing entirely. She was nothing more than a tool in his game, a piece on the chessboard that he had decided to move. The weight of that realization hit her like a wave. But before she could respond, a voice cut through the tension. A woman, tall and regal, stepped forward, her eyes blazing with indignation. Olivia recognized her as one of the Duke's closest allies, a woman with power in her own right. "Your Grace, surely this is a mistake," the woman said, her voice dripping with contempt. "She is not fit for this. She does not belong here." The Duke didn't even flinch. His gaze shifted to the woman, his eyes cold, implacable. "She belongs here more than you ever will," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. Olivia felt a rush of disbelief. She had been rejected by society, by her own family, for so long that hearing the Duke speak those words felt unreal. Yet there it was, his decision final, his authority unchallenged. The woman who had spoken faltered, her composure cracking under the Duke's unyielding gaze. She opened her mouth to protest, but the Duke silenced her with a single look. "You will leave now," he commanded. The woman didn't argue. She bowed her head and stepped back, retreating into the crowd. Olivia could hardly believe what had just happened. The Duke's power had crushed the resistance with ease, and in that moment, she realized how little control she truly had over her own fate. The Duke had chosen her, yes, but for what purpose? And what did it mean for her now? She didn't know. All she knew was that her life, her future, was now entirely at the mercy of a man who held the power to shape everything with a single word. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest as the Duke led her deeper into the ballroom. Every eye in the room was on her, but she could barely feel the weight of their gaze now. It was the Duke's presence that consumed her, his hand, firm against her waist, his breath steady but heavy with unspoken commands. He had chosen her, but now she could feel the full weight of that decision pressing down on her, suffocating her. She wasn't just standing at his side anymore. She was part of a game she didn't fully understand, one where power shifted with a glance, with a movement, with a single word. The aristocracy around them had begun to murmur again, their whispers like the flutter of moths' wings, constant, inevitable, and filled with judgment. Olivia could feel their eyes, sharp and cutting, as they examined every movement she made. Her steps felt too loud, too unsteady on the marble floors, but she couldn't pull away. The Duke was guiding her, leading her through this suffocating labyrinth of high society. She felt small in comparison to him, even though he had chosen her, even though he had marked her. The dance, once a symbol of elegance, now felt like a battlefield. The Duke's grip on her tightened for a fraction of a second, and she noticed the slightest shift in his posture. She was hyper-aware of him now, of every subtle change in his demeanor. His fingers flexed against her back, a sharp command in the way he moved her through the crowd. She wanted to say something, anything to break the tension, but the words stuck in her throat. She could feel the weight of the room pressing in on her, the silence that hung between the beats of the music. No one dared speak above a whisper. It was as though the space itself had become a stage, and they were the only players on it. His eyes never left hers. His gaze was as cold as it was intense, and it made her skin prickle with both fear and something else she couldn't quite place. He was studying her, measuring her every reaction. It felt like an unspoken test, one she wasn't sure she could pass. The music swelled again, but it felt distant, fading into the background as the tension between them escalated. Olivia's breath quickened, and she could feel the eyes of the room weighing on her, pressing her down. She wasn't the girl she had been moments ago, unnoticed, invisible. She was something more now, a pawn in the Duke's game. The Duke's hand moved lower on her back, and she stiffened at the new proximity. His fingers pressed against her spine, guiding her with ease, as if she were merely an extension of his will. Every step she took felt like a deliberate move, his power seeping into her very bones, making her feel more controlled than she had ever felt in her life. And then, without warning, his voice broke the silence between them. "You think you're invisible," he said, his tone low and steady, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. Olivia's breath caught in her throat, her body freezing in place. She didn't know what to say. The Duke's gaze sharpened, like a predator closing in on its prey. "But you're not." His words were simple, but they held an undeniable weight. She wasn't invisible anymore. Not to him. Not to anyone in this room. The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. She was no longer the girl standing in the corner, ignored and overlooked. She was the one the Duke had chosen, and that choice had made her the center of a storm she didn't know how to survive. The murmurs from the room grew louder, more insistent, and Olivia felt her stomach turn. The room was divided now, half watching in awe, half whispering in disgust. The Duke had chosen her, but to what end? She couldn't even begin to guess. His hand moved again, this time pulling her closer, their bodies nearly touching. The action was deliberate, controlling, as if he were staking his claim. She could feel the heat radiating off him, and for a moment, her mind blanked. The power shift was undeniable, the tension building in ways she couldn't escape. Every eye in the room was on them, on her, and Olivia felt like the walls were closing in. "You're mine now," the Duke whispered, his breath warm against her ear. She shivered involuntarily, but she didn't pull away. He was right. She had been chosen. But by whom? And for what purpose? She didn't know the answer, but she knew she was powerless to stop whatever was coming next. The music swelled again, the rhythm pulling her forward, and she had no choice but to follow. She was no longer invisible. She was now a part of the Duke's world, a world she had never asked to be a part of, but one she was trapped in. And as they moved through the crowd, the whispers grew louder, the judgment more obvious. The room had already decided her fate, and the Duke? He hadn't made a mistake. His choice had already been made, and now, they would all watch as she stepped into the life he had laid out for her. As they danced, Olivia realized that this was no fairy tale. There was no love, no romance in the way the Duke looked at her. This was about power, and in his world, she was nothing but a pawn, a piece to be moved at his will. The dance was over, but the game had just begun. The Duke had chosen her, but now she had to survive him. Olivia could feel the weight of the Duke's gaze even as he let go of her hand. The tension between them had thickened, palpable and unrelenting. She stood in the center of the ballroom, but it felt like the walls were closing in around her. The whispers had started again, this time louder, more insistent. The aristocrats, once so polished and poised, were now openly eyeing her, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. She could hear the snide remarks, the sharp intakes of breath, but she didn't dare turn to meet their stares. She could only focus on the Duke, how he commanded the room with every movement, every step he took. She had been chosen, yes, but now she was beginning to understand just how fragile that choice was. The Duke had set the stage, but she was not the one in control. He was. He always had been. As the room shifted, she felt the pull of his presence once again, this time stronger than ever. The Duke was across the room now, surrounded by other nobles, yet Olivia couldn't tear her eyes away from him. He didn't need to move to hold her attention. His stillness, his cold expression, was enough to make her heart race. And then, without warning, he looked at her again. His gaze was piercing, calculating, as if he were evaluating her every move, every breath she took. The tension between them had reached its peak, and Olivia could feel it building inside her, tightening like a coil, waiting to snap. She didn't know what he wanted from her, but she could feel the weight of his expectations pressing down on her, suffocating her. He was watching her closely now, not with the detachment of someone observing a show, but with the focus of a man who had decided that the time for games was over. He was waiting for something. For her. To move, to speak, to give some sign that she was worthy of the attention he had chosen to bestow upon her. But Olivia had no words, no actions, only the intense feeling that she was caught in a trap of her own making. His eyes never wavered as they locked on hers. Her pulse quickened as she stood motionless, unable to break the connection. The room had fallen away, and all that remained was the two of them, suspended in this moment of unspoken power. She could feel the weight of every judgmental glance, every whisper that sliced through the air like a blade. She was trapped, but what terrified her most was that, somehow, she didn't want to escape. She wanted him to see her, to choose her, to make her feel like she was not just a woman who had been discarded by society, but someone who mattered. But the Duke was not interested in comforting her, in offering her kindness. No, he was interested in power, in control. And in that moment, Olivia realized that she had become another tool in his game. The realization hit her like a cold wave, leaving her breathless and exposed. He had chosen her, but it wasn't for any reason she could understand. It wasn't out of love, or affection, or desire. It was because he could. It was because he held the power to do so, and in his world, that was enough. Olivia's legs felt weak beneath her, but she didn't dare move. She couldn't. The Duke was still watching her, his eyes now narrowed, as though waiting for her to make the first move. But how could she? She didn't even know the rules of this game. The ballroom felt like a stage now, the nobility watching intently, waiting for her to react, to give them something to talk about. Olivia's hand trembled slightly, and she clenched her fingers into a fist, trying to steady herself. She was nothing. She had been nothing. But the Duke had chosen her. And now, she was everything. She could feel her heart racing, her mind spinning with uncertainty. Every step she had taken in this world, every decision she had made, had led her to this moment. A moment where everything she knew about herself, about her place in society, had been shattered. The Duke had chosen her, yes, but what did that mean for her now? Was this her chance to prove herself? To show the world that she was not just another forgotten woman? Or was it just another cruel reminder of how easily she could be cast aside once he was done with her? Olivia didn't know. But as the Duke moved closer, she knew one thing. Nothing in her life would ever be the same. He was walking toward her now, his steps deliberate, his gaze never leaving her face. The crowd parted once more as if they knew what was coming. She could feel the eyes on her, but it didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered but the Duke. His presence was overwhelming, his power suffocating, and yet, she couldn't look away. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough that she could almost taste the tension between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched on, suffocating in its weight. Olivia stood frozen, her breath shallow, her body tense with anticipation. And then, without warning, the Duke spoke. "You will learn your place," he said, his voice cold and unwavering. The words hit her like a blow, sending a shiver down her spine. She didn't know if he meant it as a warning or as a command, but either way, the message was clear. She had no choice but to accept her role in his world. The Duke's hand moved again, this time reaching for hers. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as she placed her hand in his, her fingers trembling under his touch. He didn't say another word, but his grip tightened slightly, a silent command to follow. And without a choice, she did. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer the woman in the shadows. She was the Duke's choice, and now she would have to live with the consequences. The weight of the Duke's presence was crushing. Olivia could feel the power radiating from him as he held her hand firmly in his fingers like chains that bound her to him, pulling her through the crowd. Every step she took with him felt like a trap, and yet, she couldn't pull away. There was nowhere to run now. She was caught in the snare of his gaze, a prisoner to the force that was the Duke. The ballroom, once a place of celebration and elegance, now felt like a battlefield. The nobility watched, their eyes fixed on the two of them, murmurs spreading like wildfire. The whispers that had been quiet before were now loud, insistent, like a rising storm. Olivia could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her, suffocating her with every breath. She had been nothing but a shadow in this world, a woman discarded by society. But now, she was at the center of it all. She was his chosen one, and that was enough to make the room tremble. With uncertainty, the Duke's hand tightened around hers as they moved through the crowd. His grip was unyielding, commanding her every step. She was no longer invisible, no longer the quiet, overlooked noblewoman she had once been. She was something else now, something to be watched, to be judged. She could feel their eyes on her. The noblewomen who had once looked down on her now watching with a mixture of envy and disdain. The men, who had never given her a second glance before, now studied her with a calculating gaze, as though trying to figure out what the Duke saw in her. And then, there was the Duke. His presence was overwhelming, suffocating, and yet, it was the one thing that kept her grounded. His power was undeniable, his control unchallenged. He moved through the room with an air of authority that made the space around him shrink. The other nobles stepped back, parting for him as though he were a king. He was a man who held the room in his palm, and now, Olivia was the one he had chosen to display to the world. The tension between them was palpable. Every step they took, every movement they made, felt charged with electricity, as though the very air around them was on the verge of snapping. Olivia could feel the Duke's eyes on her, watching her every move, every subtle shift of her body, as if he were searching for something. She couldn't explain it, but there was a deep, unsettling feeling in her chest, an awareness that she was being measured. She wasn't just a part of his world. She was an object to be controlled, studied, and understood. She had no control in this situation. None at all. The Duke led her to the center of the ballroom, and the moment they reached it, he stopped. The music seemed to fade into the background, the laughter and chatter of the guests growing distant. It was just the two of them now, the tension thick between them, suffocating the space around them. The room had become their stage, and the rest of the world had faded away. Olivia stood still, unable to move. She felt the eyes of the room on her, each gaze heavy with judgment, with questions. They wanted to know what the Duke saw in her, what made her worthy of his attention. She didn't have an answer. She didn't know. All she knew was that the Duke had chosen her, and that choice had placed her in the center of a storm she couldn't escape. The Duke's grip on her hand tightened, and Olivia felt her heart race. His gaze never left hers, his eyes dark and unreadable. She could feel his power, his control, wrapping around her like a vice, making it impossible to think, to breathe. And then, without a word, he moved closer, closing the distance between them. His hand, still firm on hers, moved to her waist, pulling her closer. Olivia's breath hitched in her throat, and she froze, the proximity of his body sending a shock through her. She could feel the heat of him, his strength, his authority. It was overwhelming. His lips parted slightly, but he said nothing. It didn't matter. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone was enough to silence the room, to make everyone watch. Olivia could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her body tense with anticipation. She wanted to speak, to break the silence, but no words came. The Duke's eyes flickered down to her lips, then back to her eyes, and for a moment, she thought he might kiss her. But instead, he stepped back. The room seemed to breathe again, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. Olivia's chest rose and fell with each breath, her mind spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The Duke had pulled her close, but he hadn't kissed her. He hadn't done anything to give her any clue as to what he wanted from her. And yet, in that moment, she understood. He didn't need to kiss her. He didn't need to do anything. He had already claimed her. He had already chosen her. And that was all that mattered. The room had fallen silent once more, and Olivia could feel the eyes of the guests on her, the weight of their judgment suffocating. She had been chosen. She had been placed at the center of the Duke's world, and now, she would have to live with the consequences. The Duke's power was unchallenged, and she was nothing more than a pawn in his game. And yet, as she stood there, trying to steady her breath, a small part of her wanted more. She wanted to understand why he had chosen her, why he had marked her in front of everyone. She wanted to know what he saw in her, what it meant to be chosen by a man like him. But for now, all she could do was wait. The Duke had chosen her, and the rest of the world was watching. The game had begun. Olivia's heart raced as the Duke's presence loomed over her, commanding and unyielding. The pressure in the air thickened, like a storm waiting to break. She could feel the heat of his hand on her back, guiding her through the sea of aristocrats who parted for them like waves parting for a ship. The room felt smaller, suffocating, as though the weight of their gaze was closing in on her, watching, waiting for something to happen. The whispers had grown louder, more frantic, but Olivia couldn't bring herself to care about them now. She was standing at the edge of a precipice, her feet moving mechanically as the Duke's grip tightened on her waist. His eyes never wavered, focused on her with a mixture of cold calculation and something deeper, something more dangerous. As they moved further into the ballroom, the Duke's pace slowed. Olivia could feel the sudden shift in the air. He had stopped guiding her with the same firmness as before. Now, it was as if he were testing her, waiting for her to break. Every step she took, every move she made, felt like it was being scrutinized under a magnifying glass. Her breath quickened, her nerves raw, but she dared not look away from him. The tension was suffocating, every moment stretching longer than the last. The Duke's presence was a storm cloud hanging over her, and she felt like she was caught in its center, powerless to escape. He was in control, always in control, and she was nothing but a pawn in his game. The movement of the crowd around them seemed to slow as the Duke's grip tightened, pulling her closer, forcing her to look up at him. The world around them disappeared. His eyes bored into hers with an intensity that made her stomach flutter, her heart pounding faster. She wanted to speak, to ask him what he wanted from her, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she stood there, frozen in place, unable to escape his gaze, unable to move. "Do you know why you're here?" His voice was low, a whisper that cut through the tension like a knife. His words weren't a question, but a command. Olivia swallowed, trying to steady her breath, but her voice failed her. She could feel his eyes on her, searching her, weighing her. She was nothing in his world, nothing but another object to be controlled, another game piece to be moved. But still, his hand did not loosen its grip on her. His fingers were like iron, pulling her closer. "Answer me," he demanded again, his voice a sharp edge. "Why are you here?" Olivia's mind raced, trying to piece together some coherent response. The truth was, she didn't know why she was here. She had been cast aside by society, invisible to the world that now watched her. But the Duke had seen her, chosen her, and now she had no choice but to follow. She was at his mercy, and she could feel it in every inch of her body. "Because you wanted me here," she finally whispered, her voice trembling under the weight of his gaze. His eyes narrowed, a faint glimmer of something unreadable passing through them. He said nothing, but his grip tightened slightly, as though marking her answer as insufficient, as though she hadn't truly grasped the depth of the question. She wanted to pull away, to free herself from his hold, but the pressure in his hand kept her tethered to him, bound by something she couldn't escape. The crowd around them had stopped moving, their eyes fixed on the Duke and Olivia. They were waiting for her to break, to collapse under the weight of his power. She could feel their expectations, their judgment, like a silent storm that raged inside her. The Duke's silence was deafening, and she could feel the moment slipping further out of her control. He hadn't spoken a word in minutes, but his eyes, those cold, piercing eyes, still held her captive. The music had faded into the background, the laughter of the other guests a distant echo. All that mattered now was the Duke and the power he held over her. "You have no idea what you've just stepped into," he said suddenly, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. The words sent a chill down her spine. "But you will learn. You will. Learn your place in this world." His words hung in the air, sharp and final. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as she realized what he was saying. She wasn't just a pawn. She was a tool. Something to be shaped, to be controlled. She had been nothing before him, and now she was his, whether she wanted to be or not. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, and she felt the ground beneath her shift, the room tilting as the world she thought she knew crumbled around her. She wanted to scream, to run, to flee from the Duke's hold and the pressure that threatened to crush her. But she didn't. She couldn't. His grip on her wrist was firm, like chains that bound her to him. The crowd was waiting, the whispers growing louder, but Olivia stood motionless, caught between the storm inside her and the Duke's relentless gaze. And then, just as quickly as the moment had escalated, the Duke released her. His hand slid away from her wrist, and Olivia stumbled slightly, her heart still racing in her chest. The room around them began to breathe again, but the tension was far from gone. The Duke had let go, but the power he wielded was still there, hanging in the air like a thick fog. The whispers started again, louder now, more insistent. Olivia could feel their eyes on her, could feel the weight of their judgment, but it was no longer just about the crowd. It was about the Duke. He had chosen her. He had marked her. And now, she was part of his world. There was no turning back. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't just a forgotten woman. She was someone the Duke had decided to shape, to control, to use. And as the room continued to move around her, Olivia felt the weight of that decision settle heavily on her shoulders. The tension in the ballroom had reached its peak, and Olivia could feel the weight of every single eye on her. The Duke's grip on her wrist was firm, his fingers unyielding as he guided her through the crowd. She could hear the hushed whispers of the nobles around her, their voices sharp with judgment, and her heart raced as her mind struggled to catch up with the chaos unfolding around her. She was no longer the woman who had stood in the corner, unnoticed. She was the one everyone was watching, the one everyone was talking about. But it wasn't admiration she saw in their eyes, it was disbelief. The Duke had chosen her, and that alone had turned her world upside down. She was caught between the power he held over her and the harsh whispers of society, each tugging her in a different direction. As they moved further into the center of the room, Olivia felt a shift in the air. The Duke's hand tightened around hers, pulling her even closer, his presence swallowing her whole. The room seemed to fade away, and all that remained was him. His grip was a constant reminder of his control, of the power he wielded over her. She had once been invisible, but now she was a prize to be displayed, a symbol of his strength. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her, the expectation in their eyes so heavy she could barely breathe. She had been nothing, but now she was something, something to be owned, something to be controlled. The Duke's eyes never left hers, his gaze piercing and unreadable. The silence between them was suffocating, but it was also filled with a quiet intensity, as though the moment was about to crack open and reveal something far darker. Olivia tried to steady her breath, but her heart was pounding in her chest, and the air felt thick with tension. The power dynamic had shifted, but it wasn't in her favor. She had been chosen, yes, but she wasn't sure for what. She wasn't sure she could survive in this world the Duke had drawn her into. The weight of her new reality settled in her chest, suffocating her as the crowd continued to watch, their gaze unwavering. The Duke's hand moved from her wrist to the small of her back, guiding her forward with a single, decisive motion. She wanted to protest, to pull away, but she couldn't. She was trapped, both in his hold and in the world he had thrust her into. The crowd around them seemed to move in slow motion, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. But still, the Duke led her through it all, his steps deliberate and unyielding. Every movement was calculated, every glance sharp, as if he were orchestrating the entire scene. He was in control, and Olivia was nothing more than a piece in his game. "You think you have a choice," he said suddenly, his voice low, a whisper only for her. The words sent a shiver down her spine. "But you don't. Not anymore." The finality in his voice struck her like a blow. She was nothing more than an object to be moved at his will, a pawn in a game she hadn't agreed to play. She had no say in this, no agency. The Duke had chosen her, and now she would have to live with the consequences. His hand pressed more firmly against her back, forcing her to move forward, into the heart of the ballroom, where the eyes of every noble in the room were fixed on her. She felt their gaze like a weight pressing down on her chest. She couldn't escape. The Duke's grip on her tightened once more, pulling her even closer, until their bodies were nearly flush with one another. The room around them seemed to freeze for a moment, the tension thick and palpable, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Olivia's breath hitched in her throat as she felt the Duke's presence overwhelming her. He was so close, his body a constant reminder of his power, of his control. Her mind raced as she struggled to understand what this all meant. She was chosen, but for what? To be a symbol? To be his possession? She had no answers, only the crushing weight of his dominance, the power he held over her. The room seemed to close in around her, the whispers intensifying, and for a moment, she couldn't tell where the Duke ended and she began. She was lost in the storm of his control, the suffocating pressure of the crowd, and the overwhelming sense that everything in her life had just shifted irrevocably. The Duke's eyes never left hers, his gaze dark and unreadable. He had taken everything from her, the control, the choice, the freedom, and in its place, he had offered her only one thing, himself. But as the tension built to a crescendo, Olivia realized that she didn't know what to do with that. She didn't know how to survive in this new world, in this new role he had created for her. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but she couldn't. She had no voice here. The Duke's hand tightened once more, pulling her closer, his body pressing against hers in a way that left her breathless. But it was not a comforting touch. It was a reminder that she had no choice, no escape. And then, just as quickly as the moment had built, it shattered. The Duke released her from his grasp, his hand slipping away as he stepped back. The room seemed to breathe again, the whispers fading into a dull hum. But Olivia was still trapped in the space between the power he held over her and the unrelenting weight of her own uncertainty. She wanted to run, to flee, but she knew she couldn't. Not anymore. The game had begun, and there was no turning back. The tension in the room was unbearable, the air thick with anticipation. Olivia stood at the edge of the ballroom, the weight of the Duke's presence pressing down on her like a storm cloud ready to break. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, the sound of her heartbeat loud in her ears. She had been chosen, but she hadn't yet fully understood the depth of what that meant. The whispers of the aristocracy continued to swirl around them, But this time, it was different. The room felt colder, more suffocating, and Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The Duke, standing beside her, still exuded an air of calm authority, his grip on her wrist a constant reminder of the control he held over her. But as she looked up at him, she saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip a beat, a flicker of something unexpected. It was a brief moment, barely perceptible, but it was enough to make her question everything. What did he want from her? What game was he playing? She wasn't the woman she had been before, the one who had stood in the corner, invisible. She had been thrust into his world, a world where power reigned and everything was up for grabs. As the Duke's gaze met hers, something shifted in the air. His hand moved from her wrist to her shoulder, the touch firm but not without tenderness, almost as if he were reassuring her. She froze under his touch, a surge of conflicting emotions flooding her. Was this his way of showing control, or was it something else? Before she could make sense of her thoughts, the sound of a voice broke the silence. "Your Grace." The voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it, sharp like a knife. Olivia turned, her eyes falling on a man who had stepped forward from the crowd. His presence was imposing, his eyes cold and calculating. He was someone Olivia had seen before, a member of the Duke's inner circle, one of the men whose power in the room rivaled the Duke's. But there was something different about him now, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. "There are others who might be more suitable," the man continued, his gaze flicking to Olivia, then back to the Duke. The Duke's grip on Olivia's shoulder tightened, but he said nothing. Olivia could feel the tension between the two men, the unspoken challenge hanging in the air. The man's words were a direct challenge to the Duke's decision, a reminder that in this world, power was never permanent, never guaranteed. The Duke's expression remained unreadable, but Olivia could feel the shift in him. Something was about to happen, and she had no idea what. "Perhaps," the Duke replied, his voice low, his gaze never leaving Olivia. "But it is my decision, not yours." The finality in his words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The room seemed to breathe with the tension, the aristocrats holding their breath as the power dynamic between the men shifted dramatically. The man opened his mouth to protest, but the Duke held up a hand, silencing him with a single gesture. Olivia's pulse quickened as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. The Duke's authority was unquestioned, and the shift in power was unmistakable. She was no longer just a woman in the background. She had become the focus of a struggle that she had not fully understood until now. The man took a step back, bowing his head in reluctant submission, but his eyes never left the Duke. Olivia could feel the tension crackling in the air like electricity. She had been chosen, but now she understood that her place in the Duke's world was not secure. It was a constant battle for control, and she was a pawn in it. The Duke's hand moved to her waist, pulling her closer. His touch was deliberate, as if marking her, claiming her as his own. The room seemed to disappear around them, the noise of the aristocrats fading into a dull hum. It was just the Duke and her now, their bodies close, their fates intertwined. She could feel his breath on her neck, his presence suffocating yet strangely comforting. For the first time, she felt the full weight of what it meant to be the Duke's choice. It was not a privilege. It was a burden. She was a piece in his game, and her fate was no longer in her hands. The Duke's eyes locked onto hers, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his gaze that made her heart race. Something dark, something she couldn't define. "You belong to me," he said, his voice low and commanding. The words hit her like a blow, a punch to her chest that left her breathless. She wasn't sure if it was a threat or a promise, but the weight of it was undeniable. She was trapped, bound to the Duke by forces she didn't fully understand. The room around them seemed to freeze for a moment, the tension reaching its peak. The whispers faded into silence, the aristocrats holding their breath as they watched the Duke and Olivia. She had been chosen, but at what cost? And what was her place in this world of power, manipulation, and control? Olivia wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't. She was his. She had been marked, claimed, and there was no escape. The game had begun, and she was trapped in it, a pawn with no way out. The Duke's grip tightened on her waist, pulling her closer, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of his power, the full weight of what he had chosen for her. The room seemed to shift, the world tilting around her, and she realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The weight of the Duke's presence was suffocating, his grip on her wrist firm and unyielding as he pulled her further into the center of the ballroom. The aristocracy was silent now, every pair of eyes fixed on Olivia, and she could feel the pressure of their judgment, their expectations, closing in on her. The whispers had died down, but the tension in the room was palpable, thick like smoke. The Duke stood beside her, his posture straight, his expression a mask of calm authority, but she could feel the undercurrent of something darker beneath the surface. She had been chosen, yes, but what did that truly mean? She had been thrust into a world where every move she made would be scrutinized, where her very existence seemed to stir up the aristocracy's disdain. The Duke's gaze remained fixed on her, his eyes sharp, calculating. She had no way of knowing what he saw when he looked at her, but she could feel the weight of his judgment. She wasn't just a woman to him. She was a piece in his game, a tool to be manipulated. And yet, there was something in the way he held her, something that made her wonder if there was more to this than just power and control. The crowd seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. The tension in the air was unbearable, the silence deafening. It was in that moment that the Duke spoke again, his voice low but commanding. "You are mine, Olivia," he said, his words sending a chill down her spine. "You belong to me now." The words struck her like a physical blow, a harsh reminder of her place in his world. She had been nothing, and now she was his possession. But in that moment, something inside her snapped. The weight of everything, the whispers, the judgment, the control, became too much. She wasn't a pawn. She wasn't something to be moved around at his whim. She was a person, and she would not be treated like this. Olivia's breath hitched as she looked up at him, her chest tight with a mixture of fear and something else, something that felt like anger, like a spark that could ignite the storm inside her. She pulled her wrist from his grip, her fingers trembling, but her resolve hardening. "No," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it was enough to stop the Duke in his tracks. The room seemed to freeze in that moment, the noise of the crowd dying away as the weight of her words settled in the air. She could feel the shock ripple through the room, the aristocrats staring at her in disbelief. The Duke's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer, his body a mere inch away from hers, his presence overwhelming. For a moment, Olivia thought he might reach out to grab her again, to silence her, but instead, he just watched her. His gaze was cold, calculating, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, something she couldn't quite understand. "You dare defy me?" His voice was low, barely audible, but it was enough to send a shiver down her spine. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest as she looked up at him, her breath coming in short gasps. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know what he would do, but she had no choice. She had to stand her ground. "You may think you own me," she said, her voice growing stronger, more resolute. "But I am not yours to command. I am not some prize to be paraded around. I am a person, and I will not be treated like this." The words felt like they were ripping themselves from her throat, and for the first time in her life, Olivia felt like she was speaking her truth. She had been nothing, ignored and discarded, but she was not going to let the Duke or anyone else define her anymore. The Duke's eyes darkened, and for a brief moment, Olivia thought he might strike her, but instead, he stepped back. The room seemed to exhale as the tension shifted. She could feel the shift in the air. The power had not only moved between her and the Duke, but it had also moved within her. She was no longer the woman she had been, standing in the shadows, invisible and silent. She had stepped into the light, and now, she was not afraid to speak her mind. The Duke didn't speak for a moment, his eyes studying her as if he were deciding something. The air between them crackled with energy, the tension thick and unresolved. Then, slowly, he spoke again, his voice colder this time. "You think you have a choice, Olivia," he said, his words sharp. "But you don't. You never did." Olivia's chest tightened, but she refused to look away from him. The truth of his words stung, but it wasn't enough to break her resolve. She had been invisible once, but no longer. She wasn't his possession. Not now, not ever again. She wasn't sure what came next. She wasn't sure what the Duke would do, but she was done being a pawn in his game. The room had fallen silent, the aristocrats watching the power play unfold before them. She could feel their eyes, their judgment, but it didn't matter anymore. She had taken back her voice, her power, and now she would stand her ground. The Duke's gaze softened for a moment, and Olivia could have sworn she saw a flicker of something human, in his eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. The moment passed, and the Duke's demeanor hardened once more. "Very well," he said, his voice low and final. "You will learn, Olivia. You will learn your place." The words were a promise and a threat, all in one. Olivia's breath hitched, but she stood tall, her body unwavering. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer a silent observer in her own life. She was no longer afraid. And whatever the Duke had planned, she would face it head on. The power shift was complete, and there was no going back. The Duke stood in front of Olivia, his presence looming like a storm that had yet to break. The tension between them was palpable, but it was different now. The power that had once been so clearly his had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. She could feel the change in the air, a shift that both terrified and exhilarated her. She had no idea what would happen next, but one thing was clear. She wasn't the same woman who had first entered this room. She wasn't the invisible noblewoman she had once been. She had found her voice, and now she would have to live with the consequences. The aristocrats around them seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the next move. The whispers were quiet now, but the weight of their gaze was still crushing. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest as she stood before the Duke, trying to steady herself. He was looking at her, his eyes intense, his expression unreadable. His power still held sway, but she could feel the change in him as well. There was something softer in his gaze now, something that hadn't been there before. She wasn't sure what to make of it. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence between them thick and heavy. The music continued to play, but it felt distant, like a faint echo in the background. Olivia could feel every eye on her, but she didn't care anymore. The room had been waiting for her to break, to falter under the pressure. But she wouldn't. She had stood her ground. And now, as the Duke's gaze softened, she wondered if he was finally seeing her as more than just a pawn. The Duke's hand, which had once been a firm command, now rested lightly on her arm. The touch was almost gentle, but the power still lingered in the way he held her. She could feel the weight of his touch, and for a moment, she was unsure whether to pull away or lean into it. He had chosen her, but for what? To be his equal? Or to remain beneath him, forever at his mercy? "You've changed," the Duke said finally, his voice low, almost like a whisper. The words hung in the air between them, and Olivia wasn't sure how to respond. He was right. She had changed. The woman who had first stepped into this ballroom was gone, replaced by someone who refused to be invisible, someone who would not be controlled. "So have you," she replied, her voice steady, though her heart raced. The Duke's eyes darkened for a moment, but there was something else in them now, something that was not just power. It was something deeper, something more human. "I see you now," he said, his voice low but not unkind. The words struck Olivia in a way she hadn't expected. She had spent so much of her life fighting to be seen, to be acknowledged, and now, the Duke, the very man who had held her captive with his power, was finally seeing her. But it wasn't enough. She wasn't just here to be seen. She was here to take control of her own fate. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hung between them, and for a moment, the Duke didn't answer. He simply looked at her, his gaze searching, as if trying to decide what to do with her. The room around them seemed to fade, the aristocrats, the whispers, the tension. All of it felt distant now. There was only the two of them, locked in this moment, trying to figure out what came next. Finally, the Duke spoke, his voice firm but not without a hint of something softer. "Now, we move forward," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "But you are no longer just a woman at my side, Olivia. You are my equal, and you will have a place at my side, not as a pawn, but as a partner." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. The words hit her like a shock, a jolt of energy that sent a rush through her veins. A partner? She had never expected this, never imagined that the Duke, so cold, so controlled, would see her as anything more than a tool to be used. But here he was, acknowledging her, offering her something she had never dared to hope for. The tension between them had shifted, and for the first time, Olivia felt like she had a real place in his world. She wasn't sure what that meant yet, or where it would lead, but it was something. It was enough. The Duke's hand, still resting lightly on her arm, moved slowly, gently, until it cupped her chin, lifting her face to meet his. The touch was tender, intimate, and for a brief moment, Olivia felt the warmth of it seep into her skin, calming the storm inside her. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze with a mixture of uncertainty and newfound strength. The power had shifted again, this time in her favor. She was no longer the woman who had been cast aside, overlooked, and discarded. She had a place here now. She had power. "What happens now?" she repeated, her voice stronger this time. The Duke's lips quirked into a small smile, but there was still that unreadable depth in his eyes. "Now," he said, his voice steady, "we write our own story." The words hung in the air between them, and Olivia realized that, for the first time, she wasn't afraid to write it. She wasn't afraid to take control of her own future, to decide what came next. The room around them slowly began to come back into focus, the whispers, the judgment, the tension all returning. But Olivia didn't care. She had faced the Duke, stood her ground, and now she was standing in the center of her own story. She was no longer his pawn. She was his equal, and whatever came next, she would face it head-on. The room was still, suspended in time. The aristocrats had long since fallen silent, their gazes fixed on the Duke and Olivia, who stood together in the center of the ballroom. The heavy weight of their attention pressed down on her, but this time, it was different. She wasn't the woman she had been when she first stepped into this world, unnoticed and insignificant. Now, she stood beside the Duke as his equal, a force of her own making, and the room felt smaller for it. The Duke's presence was as commanding as ever, but Olivia no longer felt small in comparison. She had stood her ground, faced him head-on, and what had once been an unbalanced power dynamic had shifted. She had found her place, not as a pawn, but as someone worthy of standing by his side. His hand, which had once felt like a chain, now rested lightly on her arm, a symbol of their new dynamic. The way he looked at her was different now, too. There was no longer the cold, calculating gaze of a man in control. Now, there was something else, something softer, though still just as powerful. For a moment, they simply stood there, the crowd around them a blur of motion, a distant hum. The music played, the dancers twirled, but none of it mattered. All that mattered was the space between them, the shift that had occurred. The Duke's gaze flickered over her, his eyes searching, almost as if he were trying to decipher her. Olivia met his gaze, her breath steady, her heart still racing, but this time, she felt no fear. He had taken her in, marked her, but she had not been broken by it. She had risen. "You've proven yourself," the Duke said, his voice low but filled with an unmistakable approval. The words sent a shiver down her spine, and for a moment, Olivia wasn't sure what to make of them. She had thought he would see her as nothing but a tool, an object to be used in his game, but instead, he had acknowledged her, not as a servant or a plaything, but as someone with power, someone capable of standing on her own. The realization hit her in that moment. This was not just about survival. It was about strength. It was about carving out a place for herself in this world, in this society that had rejected her. And she had done it. The tension that had built between them, the unspoken conflict that had simmered beneath the surface, was gone now, replaced by something else, a shared understanding, a new equilibrium. Olivia could feel the weight of it in her chest, the steady thrum of triumph that pulsed through her veins. "But it's not just about proving yourself, Olivia," the Duke continued, his voice softening, almost gentle now. "It's about knowing your worth. And I've come to realize that you are worth more than I initially thought." His words struck her like a lightning bolt, leaving her breathless. He had chosen her, yes, but now, he was acknowledging her value, her strength, in a way she hadn't expected. She wasn't just a woman to be controlled, a pawn in his game. She was his equal. She had proved it. The realization was liberating. She had found her place beside him, not behind him, not beneath him, but beside him, as an equal in every sense of the word. The room around them seemed to fade away as the weight of the moment settled over them both. The crowd, the whispers, the judgment, none of it mattered anymore. They had reached the peak, the culmination of everything they had built together, and now, nothing would ever be the same. The Duke's hand slid from her arm to her back, pulling her closer, but it wasn't possessive now. It was a gesture of connection, of partnership. She could feel his warmth, his strength, but also his respect. For the first time, Olivia felt like she belonged, not because